How much time has passed in Star Wars The Old Republic from the moment you hit play? In this video, we'll be covering the complete timeline of Star Wars The Old Republic. By the time you finish this video, you will no longer be confused about the SWTOR timeline, and you'll even know which order to read the relevant books in. To begin, I think it will help to understand exactly where KOTOR 1 and 2 took place first. Knights of the Old Republic 1 takes place in the year of 3960 BBY, following the story of Revan as he collects fragments of his memories and helps the Jedi to defeat Darth Malak. 5 years later brings us to the events of Knights of the Old Republic 2 in 3955 BBY, following the story of Mitra Surik, the exile, and her mysterious mentor, Kreia. Another 5 years later brings us to the events of the Revan novel in 3950 BBY, which explains Revan's disappearance from the galaxy and his encounter with the Sith Emperor on Dromund Kars. For the next 300 years the galaxy held a form of peace, and then in the year of 3700 BBY, the infamous Sith Lord, Darth Malgus, was born. The very next year, in 3699 BBY, is the birth year of the famous Jedi Satele Shan. By the time Darth Malgus was 19, the resurgent Sith Empire returned to the galaxy and retook Korriban. This was in the year of 3681 BBY and was the beginning of the Great Galactic War. Almost 30 years later, in 3653 BBY, a few important events occur. The first would be the sacking of Coruscant, which is explained in even more detail within the Malgus novel, which takes place within the same time. Following this is the Peace Treaty, a document that declared the Sith Empire victorious and ended up with both factions trading a number of worlds for control. 10 years later in 3643 BBY is the time frame of the Fatal Alliance novel, which follows the story of a dark side user, a light side user, and a Mandalorian. I won't spoil it too much because it's an amazing read. It's not mandatory for understanding the game though. This brings us to the Star Wars The Old Republic start point. Depending on which class you play, this begins between 3643 BBY and 3641 BBY. So from the moment you hit play, this is where you are. During these years, Chapter 1 and 2 of the story Origins will unfold. A few years later, in 3640 BBY, will be the conclusion of your Chapter 3 story and the universal moment where the Peace Treaty is broken. This means war breaks out once again. In this same year, the Jedi Knight will face and defeat the Emperor on Dromund Kars, along with Malgus attempting his coup of the Empire. This is also the year the Theron Shan novel takes place. 2 years later, in 3638 BBY, we see the events of Rise of the Hutt Cartel take place. Once the Mekeb story arc finishes, the Dreadmasters follow later in that year, with their showdown on Oricon. 1 year later, in 3637 BBY, are the Typhon and Korriban invasion flashpoints, where secret members of the Revanites conspire against the larger factions. Later in the same year, Revan Reborn returns and the story of Shadow of Revan unfolds. 1 more year later, in 3636 BBY, and we come to Zyost's destruction. Later in the same year, the Eternal Twins assault the galaxy, as per the cinematic sacrifice. Also in the same year, Darth Maul and the player character stumble across the Eternal Fleet in wild space. By the end of the year, the player character is captured and held in Carbonite, making this the start point for Knights of the Fallen Empire. Then of course, the player will spend 5 years in Carbonite, ending in 3631 BBY, when they are rescued by Lana Beniko. 1 year later, in 3630 BBY, we see the beginning and end of the Knights of the Eternal Throne story, bringing an end to the threat posed by the Eternal Empire. In 3629 BBY, the war for Iokath begins and the mystery of the machine gods are unravelled. In 3628 BBY, the machine gods story ends with Zildrog and the Nathema conspiracy. 1 year later, in 3627 BBY, is the beginning of the Onslaught storyline, meaning this is when Malgus returned to the galaxy and shocked everyone by being alive still. He had been declared dead since Ilum, meaning the galaxy thought he was dead for about 13 years. Another year later, in 3626 BBY, we see Darth Malgus break his chains and escape the clutches of the Empire. This is shortly after the Meridian Complex flashpoint. Just one more year later, and this brings us to the start point for Legacy of the Sith. This is 3625 BBY, and as far as we know, this is still the most recent year in the game, meaning everything that's happening right now is between 16 and 18 years after you first hit the play button. So that is how much time has passed, about 18 years in-game. In fact, the former lead writer for the game confirmed on the forums that in-game years try to match in real life years. That way it's easier to keep track. But of course we must account for the carbonite nap during Knights of the Fallen Empire. So if the game has been out for 13 years, then we add 5, that makes 18, which is a great number to work with. Tell me, how many years in game did you think had passed before watching this video? Was you close? There are some interesting threads to find on Reddit or the forum that speculate around the specific year for each class starting, but it's very hazy and hard to put together, mostly due to continuity and the story needing to make sense. Thank you for watching this video, be sure to subscribe if you didn't already, and may the Force be with you.